A Luftwaffe pilot spots it, a massive American fighter lumbering through the sky. It's huge, bulky. It looks like a flying bathtub with wings. The German pilot smirks. This will be easy. He banks his nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109 into an attack position. The American pilot sees him coming and turns to meet the threat. The German expects the heavy American plane to wallow in the turn, to struggle, to fall behind. Instead, 8 Browning M2 machine guns open fire simultaneously. 4,000 rounds per minute of .50 caliber death. The converging streams of tracers look like a solid wall of fire. The German's smirk disappears. His fighter disintegrates. Welcome to the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane the Germans mocked as the Jug, short for Juggernaut, until it became their nightmare. The heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II, the plane that could absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, then turn around and dish out even more. This is the story of how American engineering turned a supposed liability into one of the war's most feared fighters. Hit that subscribe button, because today we're diving into why German pilots learned to fear the thunder. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in England in late 1942, nobody was impressed. The British took one look at it and were politely horrified. American pilots assigned to fly it were openly dismayed, and German intelligence officers examining reconnaissance photos probably laughed out loud. The numbers told the story. The P-47 weighed 12,500 pounds empty, nearly twice as much as a Spitfire. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it tipped the scales at over 17,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than some twin-engine bombers of the era. It was massive. The fuselage was enormous, built around the largest radial engine ever fitted to a fighter aircraft, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This monster engine had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower. But all that power came with a price, size, and weight. The cockpit sat far back on the fuselage, giving pilots terrible forward visibility on the ground. The wide landing gear track made it stable for takeoffs, but the whole aircraft felt ponderous compared to sleek fighters like the P-51 Mustang or Supermarine Spitfire. American pilots who'd trained on smaller fighters looked at the P-47 with open skepticism. It was nicknamed the Jug for its resemblance to a milk jug, though some claimed it stood for Juggernaut. Either way, it wasn't a compliment at first. Republic Aviation, the company that built it, had designed the P-47 around a specific concept: high-altitude escort fighter. The massive engine was turbocharged, meaning it could maintain power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. But that advantage came at the cost of low-altitude performance and maneuverability. The prototype first flew in May 1941, and by early 1943, the first operational squadrons were arriving in England. The 56th Fighter Group would be the first to take the Thunderbolt into combat over Europe. Their commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, looked at his new aircraft with a mixture of hope and concern. The P-47 had impressive specifications on paper: 8.50 caliber machine guns, good high-altitude performance, excellent dive speed. But could this heavyweight really mix it up with experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying the nimble Bf 109s and FW 190s? The Germans were asking the same question, and they thought they knew the answer.
April 15, 1943. The P-47's combat debut over Europe. The mission was a fighter sweep over Belgium and northern France. 53 Thunderbolts from the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups thundered across the Channel, climbing to altitude. German radar picked them up immediately. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled to intercept. The first encounters were awkward. P-47 pilots quickly discovered their aircraft's weaknesses. In a turning dogfight at medium altitude, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and especially the Focke-Wulf FW-190 could outturn them. The Luftwaffe pilots, veterans with years of combat experience, knew exactly how to exploit this. German pilots would try to lure the Thunderbolts into turning fights, bleeding their energy, setting them up for the kill. And sometimes it worked. The first few months were brutal learning experiences. P-47 pilots were shot down. Some never made it home. The aircraft's reputation suffered. Luftwaffe pilots began to feel confident. Intelligence reports dismissed the P-47 as a mediocre fighter, heavy, sluggish, nothing to fear. Radio intercepts caught German pilots joking about the big fat ones and how easy they were to shoot down if you could just get them turning. But some American pilots were beginning to figure something out. Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was one of them. After a close call with an FW-190, he realized something crucial. Don't try to turn with them. Use your strengths. The P-47 had strengths, big ones. First, that massive R-2800 engine could push the Thunderbolt to speeds over 400 miles per hour in level flight and over 500 miles per hour in a dive. Nothing the Germans flew could catch a P-47 in a dive. Nothing. Second, the 8.5 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, delivered devastating firepower. Each gun fired 800 to 850 rounds per minute. When all 8 fired simultaneously, the P-47 could put out nearly 100 pounds of lead per second. The harmonization, the point where all 8 streams of bullets converged, created a zone of destruction that could soar through an enemy aircraft. Third, the aircraft was incredibly tough. That big radial engine could absorb damage that would destroy an inline engine. The rugged airframe could take hits that would bring down lighter fighters. Pilots began to call it the tank for its survivability. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the turbocharger gave the P-47 exceptional high-altitude performance. Above 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and other fighters struggled, the Thunderbolt thrived.
American pilots began developing new tactics. Instead of dogfighting, they would use boom and zoom attacks, diving from high altitude at tremendous speed, firing a devastating burst, then using their momentum to climb back to altitude before the Germans could react. It was during these early months that the P-47 earned its first successes. On June 22, 1943, Captain Gerald Johnson shot down his first German aircraft using these tactics, diving from altitude, delivering a withering burst of 50 caliber fire, then using the P-47's speed to escape. The tide was beginning to turn. Colonel Hubert, or Hub, Zemke was a tactical genius. Commanding the 56th Fighter Group, which would become known as Zemke's Wolf Pack, he understood that the P-47 required a complete rethinking of fighter tactics.
Zemke laid down new rules for his pilots. Never try to outturn a 109 or 190. Never slow down in combat. Use your speed and diving ability. Fight in the vertical, not the horizontal. Hit hard, hit fast, and use your momentum to get away. He emphasized altitude advantage.
P-47s would climb to 30,000 feet or higher before entering enemy airspace. Up there, the turbocharged R-2800 still produced full power, while German fighters struggled. The Thunderbolts could see everything below them, perfect for setting up diving attacks. The 8.50 caliber guns were harmonized to converge at 250 to 300 yards. This created a cone of fire where all 8 streams of bullets met. Anything caught in that cone was shredded. The .50 caliber round was devastating, powerful enough to tear through aircraft structures, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy engines. Zemke also taught his pilots to work in pairs, the two-ship element. One pilot would attack while his wingman covered him, watching for German fighters trying to counterattack. This mutual support system saved countless lives. The results were dramatic. By the summer of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group was racking up kills. The Germans were no longer laughing. Captain Robert S. Johnson became one of the P-47's greatest proponents after an incident in June 1943. His Thunderbolt was jumped by FW-190s and took catastrophic damage, over 200 bullet and cannon holes. His canopy was shattered, his hydraulics were destroyed, half his tail was shot away. But the R-2800 engine kept running, and the tough airframe held together. Johnson made it back across the channel and landed safely. He told reporters, "The aeroplane saved my life. No other fighter could have taken that punishment and brought me home." Stories like this spread through the fighter groups. Pilots began to trust the Thunderbolt. Yes, it was heavy. Yes, it couldn't turn with a 109, but it could absorb incredible punishment, dive like a brick, and when those 8.50 calibers opened up, nothing survived. The Germans were starting to learn this the hard way. By late 1943, the P-47's reputation had completely transformed. German fighter pilots who'd once mocked the Jug now warned each other, "Don't let the Thunderbolt dive on you. If you see one above you, run." The tactics American pilots had developed were devastating. Thunderbolt formations would patrol at extreme altitude, often 30,000 feet or higher. German fighters, struggling in the thin air, couldn't reach them. The P-47s would wait, watching, until they spotted a target, a German fighter formation, a lone bomber, anything vulnerable. Then they would strike. The dive from 30,000 feet was terrifying for German pilots. The P-47s would come screaming down at over 500 miles per hour, far too fast for the Germans to evade. The closure rate was so extreme that German pilots barely had time to react.
The P-47 excelled in multiple roles. As a bomber escort, it could protect B-17s and B-24s all the way to targets in Germany once drop tanks were fitted. The Germans could no longer savage American bomber formations without facing the Thunderbolt's wrath. As a fighter-bomber, it could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets, as much as many medium bombers. P-47s began hitting ground targets, trains, trucks, supply depots, airfields. The Germans called these attacks jabos, fighter bombers, and field them. In ground attack missions, the P-47's toughness was legendary. It could fly through intense anti-aircraft fire that would destroy other fighters. That massive radial engine, with its thick cylinders arranged in a circle, could keep running even with multiple cylinders shot out. The self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and rugged construction meant P-47s regularly returned from missions with damage that would have been fatal to other aircraft. There's a famous story from the European theater. A P-47 pilot named Lieutenant Robert White was hit by flak over Germany. The shells severed his rudder cables and destroyed most of his tail. The aircraft was barely controllable. White managed to nurse it back across Germany, over occupied France, across the English Channel, and landed it successfully in England. The ground crew counted over 150 holes in the aircraft. It flew again after repairs. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's attitude toward the P-47 had completely reversed. Intelligence reports now described it as extremely dangerous and highly effective. Pilot training manuals warned, "Do not engage in diving attacks against the Thunderbolt. Do not attempt to outdive it. Avoid combat above 25,000 feet where it has superior performance." The Germans had learned to respect the Thunder. June 6, 1944. D-Day. P-47 Thunderbolts filled the skies over Normandy. Over 1,000 Allied fighters patrolled the invasion beaches, and a huge percentage were Thunderbolts. Their job? Keep the Luftwaffe away from the vulnerable landing forces. The Luftwaffe barely showed up. German pilots knew what awaited them. Swarms of P-47s with altitude advantage ready to dive on anything that appeared. It was a fighter pilot's nightmare. The few German aircraft that did attack were quickly shot down. But the P-47's greatest contribution on D-Day and in the weeks following wasn't air-to-air combat, it was ground attack. Thunderbolts roamed over Normandy in cab ranks, standing patrols waiting for targets of opportunity. When Allied ground forces radioed for air support, P-47s would dive on German positions with bombs, rockets, and those devastating 8.5 caliber guns. The .5 caliber round could penetrate light armor. P-47 pilots discovered they could attack German tanks from above and behind, where the armor was thinnest. The top of a Panzer IV or even a Tiger tank could be vulnerable to sustained .5 caliber fire, especially if the ammunition hit fuel or ammunition storage. German troops in Normandy came to dread the sound of American radial engines. The P-47's distinctive roar, different from the higher-pitched whine of inline engines, meant death was seconds away. German soldiers called the aircraft's toughness meant it could survive ground fire. Flak was intense over Normandy. German 20mm, 37mm, and even 88mm guns filled the sky with explosive shells. P-47s flew through this hell regularly and survived. Pilots would return with aircraft so shot up that ground crews wondered how they'd stayed airborne. But that R-2800 engine kept running, and that rugged airframe held together. By the fall of 1944, P-47s were operating from bases in liberated France, flying deep into Germany. The final variant, the P-47N, with increased range, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe was a broken force by this point, but whenever German fighters did appear, P-47 pilots were ready. The tactics perfected over 2 years of combat, altitude advantage, boom and zoom attacks, mutual support, made the Thunderbolt deadly. In the Pacific theater, P-47s proved equally effective against Japanese aircraft. The big fighter's ruggedness was perfect for the harsh conditions of jungle warfare. Its firepower could shred Japanese fighters, which were lightly built for maneuverability but couldn't survive .50 caliber hits. By the end of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had compiled a remarkable record. Over 15,600 aircraft produced, making it one of the most produced American fighters. 3,752 aerial victories in Europe alone.
over 7,000 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed on the ground. Countless trains, trucks, tanks and other vehicles destroyed in ground attack missions, a loss rate significantly lower than other fighters when properly employed. The Thunderbolt shot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter type. It destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than any other fighter. It survived combat damage that would have destroyed other aircraft, and it brought its pilots home. The men who flew it came to love it. Francis Gabreski said the P-47 was a rugged plane. It could take tremendous punishment and keep flying. I never felt safer than when I was sitting in that cockpit. Robert S. Johnson wrote in his memoirs, "The Germans said the P-47 couldn't turn. They said it couldn't climb. They said it was too heavy. They were right about all of that. But what they learned too late was that it didn't matter. The P-47 fought on its own terms, and on those terms it was unbeatable." The aircraft that German pilots had mocked in 1943 became the fighter they most feared by 1945. The flying bathtub that American pilots had initially scorned became the aircraft they trusted with their lives. What made the difference? American ingenuity took what seemed like disadvantages, weight, size, bulk, and turned them into advantages. The weight came from armor protection and firepower. The size housed a massive engine that gave speed and altitude performance. The bulk provided toughness that saved pilots' lives. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that in aerial combat, as in many things, raw performance numbers don't tell the whole story. Tactics, training, and proper employment matter as much as speed and maneuverability. A heavy fighter could dominate if flown correctly, using its strengths while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. After the war, P-47s served in air forces around the world for years.
Some flew in Korea. Others served in Latin American air forces into the 1960s. But for those who flew it in World War II, the Thunderbolt was always special. Today, only a handful of P-47s remain airworthy. When they appear at air shows, that distinctive radial engine roar still turns heads. Old veterans sometimes tear up at the